All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us both on Zoom and in person today for today's Data at Your Desk workshop, Introduction to Data Analysis using Microsoft Excel. My name is Dr. Nick Ruch. I am the Research Data Management Librarian here at Florida State University Libraries. I work as part of the STEM team over in Dirac Science Library, helping students, faculty with all manner of data questions and concerns that they have. And today we'll be introducing some concepts for Microsoft Excel, how to do some kind of introductory data analysis, and some further resources for learning. All right, so before we get into the complete workshop proper, I just want to give a quick plug for Love Data Week. So we are in the midst of something called Love Data Week, which is an international event promoting good data stewardship practices and outreach around data services and all things data that many universities and data organizations participate in across the globe. We are participating here at FSU Libraries through a few different events, one of which is today's workshop, this Microsoft Excel workshop, which is also part of our Data at Your Desk series. But then we'll also be having a couple of tabling events on Thursday in Dirac Science Library and Friday in Strozier Library, each from 12 to 2, where you can come and learn more about the different services we provide at FSU Libraries and play some cool activities, talk with our data fellows, etc. So I highly encourage you, if you have time, any one of those days to come check it out. All right, so now into today's workshop. So what we will cover in today's workshop, we'll talk about how to get started with Microsoft Excel, provide an introduction to working with data in Microsoft Excel, go over formulas and functions, what those are, how to utilize those within Excel. We'll go over a specific add-on for Excel called the Data Analysis Toolpak. And we'll provide a brief overview of charts and plots towards the end of the workshop. We will not go into more advanced coding in Excel or anything like that. That's sort of out of the scope of today's workshop. So just a little bit of an introduction for Microsoft Excel. Excel is a spreadsheet software developed by Microsoft. It was first released in 1982 as a spreadsheet program called Multiplan. And it features many different tools, and those have evolved over time, such as toolbars, 3D charts, outlining. And today, as we know, Excel has many different applications in academia, private industry, government, pretty much any place, any workplace, any academic setting, where you can do things such as calculation, graphing, data analysis, and a wide variety of other applications. So there are many different uses for Excel. You can enter data into Excel that you collect either, say, out in the field or as part of a lab experiment or through a survey or some sort of qualitative analysis. You can import data that was collected maybe with another program or another tool and import that as a text file or another file type that is supported by Excel. And you can utilize Excel's different tools, formulas, functions to analyze that data. Excel is a proprietary program, so you do have to have a Microsoft license of some sort, usually a Microsoft Office license. It usually comes bundled to access Excel. There are open source versions of Microsoft Excel that are available. There are many different options for those. And they have many of the same functions as Excel, and some of those file types do transfer over. So in thinking about where you would get access to Microsoft Excel if you are a student or faculty or staff member at Florida State University, there are a few different options. You can download Excel for free as part of Florida State University's license to Microsoft Office 365 Pro Plus. If you are in either Strozier, Dirac, or out at the engineering library, you can access Microsoft Excel on the desktop computers within the library. And then the third option is particularly useful if you are off campus. We do have this site called the MyFSU Virtual Lab, maintained by ITS, and there's several different software available on there for use, and Microsoft Excel is available there. You just need to log in with your FSU credentials, and you should be able to use Microsoft Excel there. Now we're going to briefly go over some of the parts of the Excel interface. If you have used Excel before, a lot of this is going to be review. So I will go through this fairly quickly. We'll get into sort of the more data analysis type things. If you have any questions on any of this or at any point during the workshop today, please feel free to drop those in the chat. Liam is here. He'll be monitoring the chat today. Or if you're here in person, feel free to raise your hand, shout out. I'm more than happy to take questions throughout the presentation today. So to start with some definitions and sort of an outlay of Microsoft Excel, when you open an Excel file for the first time, and we'll do this in a little bit when we get into some of the demonstrations of the software, when you first open up the software, you'll see an interface such as the one shown on the slide. This is often referred to as a workbook. So the whole file here is referred to as a workbook. And within that workbook, there's often one or more worksheets to help you organize your data or any of your inputted values. These worksheets are denoted by tabs at the bottom of the screen on the bottom left-hand corner. So when you first open up a new workbook in Excel, you'll see like sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3. These are your different worksheets. You can rename these to something that more suits your project or more suits the type of data that you're working on. And I highly recommend doing that to sort of help manage and keep track of your data. And this worksheet area is where you're going to manipulate values and analyze your data. So values in Excel are organized by cells, columns, and rows. Now we'll go over what each of those actually means. So here at the top, this is a row. Rows are horizontal. And the rows are represented by numbers along the side of your sheet. So row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, etc. And then columns, these are vertical, and these are represented by letters across the top of the sheet. So column A, column B, column C, etc., etc. And a cell is the intersection between a column and a row. So essentially the address of a particular value. So in this example here that's shown at the right, you'll see we are in column B and we are in row 3. So the intersection of that is B3. And so that's what we name our cell, the notation that we use. And you'll hear me kind of refer to like these cell name and notations throughout the presentation today. So now that we've looked at what our notation is, some of our definitions, now I want to briefly mention this quick access toolbar and the menu. So Excel's menu system, which is present at the top of the screen, so above the workbook and the worksheets, all those values. This is often referred to as the ribbon. And this ribbon consists of a series of menus that are denoted by various tabs. So things like home, insert, page layout, data, etc. And under each of these, there's a wide variety of different buttons for various tasks. There's tons of different buttons. And so another really cool part of this quick access, this menu system that you can utilize, especially if you're going to be using buttons or specific functions frequently, is something called the quick access toolbar. And for that, I'm actually going to get out of this presentation. I'm going to go into Excel. All right. So the quick access toolbar is located at the top left-hand portion of the screen. So it's this part here where you see the save icon, the undo, the redo icons. By default, this is all that is there when you first start Excel. But you can add various buttons to this quick access toolbar for ease of use if you're going to be using these a lot in your analysis, in your projects. And to do that, you can just go to one of these buttons. So say you're going to be using the auto sum. So this little sign right here, say you're going to be using that quite a bit in your analysis. If you go over to this and you hover and you right click, you'll see a very small pop-up menu that will come up. And the first option will be Add to Quick Access Toolbar. So if you click that, now you see that auto sum now appears up at the top left, along with the save, the redo, and the undo. So this is a really, really nifty feature. It will save you time, especially if something isn't on the home tab, say it's in the data tab, and you want to sort, say you're going to be sorting a bunch of your different worksheets. If you add that to the quick access toolbar, it will be right there, so you won't have to go hunt that down every time. So now that we've gone over the general interface of Excel, the quick access toolbar, some good tips to get started, I'm going to briefly mention data entry and how you can enter data into a cell before we actually start going in and doing that. There's a few different ways to enter information into one of your cells in Microsoft Excel. Probably the two most common ways, and what I'm going to be doing today, you can type directly into a specific cell by clicking on that cell and typing in the data, whether that's numerical values or text values, and then hitting enter to have that value stay in that cell. You can also utilize something called the formula bar, which is denoted by this blue circle here, this f of x. So you can click on a specific cell and then click in the formula bar, which is the space next to this function notation. You can type that data into the bar and then hit enter, and that numerical or text value will then appear in that cell. You can also use headers. You can also use a form. Enter headers into the first row for all of your variables and then use that form to enter data. This could be useful if you have a larger data set that you're going to be working with. So this is an option as well, but we'll mostly be utilizing these first two options throughout the workshop today. All right, and so for the majority of the rest of the workshop, we're going to be working in Excel. We're going to be utilizing a specific data set. If you would like to follow along with what we are doing, you can utilize this bit.ly link right here. I will paste that in the chat so that everyone has it. So if you go to this bit.ly link, you should see the data set that we're going to be using for today. It's this Commute Data 2013-2019 data set. And you'll also see a copy of the slides that we're using for today's workshop as well, which will also be sent out later on after the workshop. But to use this, you can either download this data set to your computer, or if you're looking at Excel with the MyFSU Virtual Lab, upload that data to there if you wish to follow along with these example exercises. All right, so I am going to actually go into Excel now. All right, so this is the data set that we will be using for our exercises and our examples, how to utilize different functions of Excel. So I have 3 tabs here. So this is data on commute times in 3 different southern states in the United States compared to the average for the United States overall, polled for 2013 to 2019. So there are 3 different tabs here. So this first one is sort of the total values, has every single year. So 2013 to 2019 for every state. The second tab is a summary. So this is just the average time in minutes, sort of summarized in a table. We'll be using that later on for some of our examples. And then this is the data that is directly pulled from the site where we got this, which also be in the slides as well. So you can go and look at that data set and the site where we got that from. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is freeze our panes. So freeze that top row. So you'll often notice if you have a large enough data set and you're scrolling through that to look at values later on in the data set, those headers are going to disappear, right? So you can't see what those headers are, what those are referring to, which can be an issue if you are doing some sort of analysis and you're trying to remember what those are. And it can be really time consuming to keep going back up and doing that. Excel has this really nifty feature where you can actually freeze either your top row, your first column, or a custom set of rows and columns so that those will stay present whenever you're scrolling. So if you highlight whatever you want to stay, so we want this top row with those headers. If we go to the View tab and go over to Freeze Panes, which is over here under this Windows section of that menu. If we click over on this little down arrow, you'll see we have a few different options. So we can freeze sort of a selection of rows and columns. We can freeze the top row, or we can freeze the first column. So here we're going to freeze that top row. So we click that. And it's a little hard to see, but there is a little bit of a line that Excel puts out. But you'll see when you scroll down through this worksheet, those headers stay there. You can still see them even when you have surpassed all of the rest of the values. So this is really nifty if you're working with particularly large data sets and you want to sort of keep track of the definitions for those different variables. So the next thing that is particularly useful is sorting your data. So if you get a data set such as this, with different values, variables, rows, and columns, it's kind of just inputted. Sometimes it's not super clean. And sometimes before you do any sort of analysis on this, you want to clean this data up a little bit, right? You want to sort this by certain criteria so that you can more easily do analysis on that data. So for this, we can use the sort function. And if we go to, let's see, where was I at? Data, yes. So if we go to our data tab over here in Excel, and you see this sort button right here. So if we click on that, we'll see here that we haven't actually selected any data. So you do have to select some part of your data set first, something with values in them, either text or numerical values. So if we click this and we go to sort, one thing you will want to make sure you check if your data does have headers in that is this My Data Has Headers box. That way it will sort of ignore those headers when it's actually sorting your numerical and text values. Otherwise, it will sort them in with all of your other data as well, and you have to go back and re-clean all of that. So once we have selected all of our data, we can now decide how we want to sort that data. And one thing you will want to make sure, it did it automatically here, and it does this sometimes in the newer versions of Excel, but you'll want to make sure all of your data is highlighted that you want to actually sort. We only clicked on one value, it automatically selected the rest of our data. In some versions of Excel or in some instances, it'll ask you if you want to kind of spread that to the rest of your data if you only have one value selected. So make sure what is highlighted is the data range that you want to sort. So now we get this sort box, and now we decide how we want to sort this and what criteria we want to use. So it's first going to give us a selection of the different columns that we have. So we can decide which column we want to sort by first. And we will talk about how to do sort of multiple levels of sorting in just a minute. So let's say that we want to first sort by geography. So let's say we want to get all of those states sorted together within our data set. So if we go here to geography, and then it's going to ask you sort on. So there's a few different options here. Most of the time you're just going to sort on cell values. If you've done some sort of conditional formatting, you might sort by that as well. Or if you're utilizing cell colors or font colors or something like that within your spreadsheet, you might sort on them as well if you've color-coded things. But most of the time, you're probably going to be using these cell values. And then you need to select how you're going to sort those, in what order you're going to sort those. Here, since we are using sort of text data, so this is all the names of states, we can either sort this sort of in alphabetical order going from A to Z, or we could sort it in reverse alphabetical order going from Z to A. Or we can make our own custom sorting. But for demonstration, we are just going to select A to Z, hit OK. And so you'll see now within our data set, so if we look at column D, and I'm going to highlight this and make this a little bigger, and you can kind of arrange the sizes of these by just hovering over that little spot that's right in between the two columns. So there's a little line there, and I'm going to use that to change the width. And you'll see now that we have sorted by our different states. So we see all of the data for Alabama, all of the data for Florida, all of the data for Georgia, and then all of the data for the United States. And it sorted the rest of our data as well throughout the rest of our spreadsheet. And that's why you want to make sure that entire spreadsheet or that entire selection of data is sorted so that it will sort all of the data within your data set. Now, that was one option. Often you'll want to sort by more than one level or more than one criteria, so you can do that. To do that, if you go back to this sort box, you can click Add Level. So this will add a spot for you to put a second criteria upon which to sort by. And it's going to do these in whichever order that you have. So let's say that our other criteria would be average commute time. So that's our column C. We are going to sort again by cell values. And then this instance, since this is numerical data, it gives us the option of smallest to largest or largest to smallest. Let's go largest to smallest in this instance. So what this is going to do is if you enter this all at once, it would first sort by that geography column, so column D, and then it would sort by average commute time, sort of with that first criteria applied. So if we hit OK, so you'll see we are still sorted by our states, but then within each of those sort of subparts of our data set, we are now sorted from highest to lowest. So we've done that for each portion of our data. So that's how you would go in and sort your data. You can apply quite a few different levels. I don't know if there's an exact limitation. There probably is. But you can put all those levels in at once. You can do like I did and sort of do one at a time. But that will help you sort of sort through your data before you get into your analysis, sort of do a little bit of data cleaning. All right. So I'll pause here for just a second, see if anyone has questions on this part. If you do, feel free to drop those in the chat. If it's clear, we will go on to the next portion. All right, so we've talked about sorting data. I want to also mention formatting. So if you go to the Home tab and you go over to this kind of number kind of sub spot, you'll see if you click on this arrow, there are several different number formats. And this is how Excel is going to output that specific data. This can be important depending on the type of data that you are working with, the type of analysis that you are doing. The kind of default in Excel is general, so there's not really a specific format. But if we go in and say we want to see what this number format is. So if we click on number format, you'll see that this changes the highlighted cells to where now we only have 2 spots after the decimal point. So we only have 2 what are known as significant figures. So this is what Excel will default to with this format. I actually like to go to this more numbers formats here. You can actually see a little bit more and do a little bit more here. Just clicking on that menu doesn't give a whole lot of information on what they mean by these different formats. But you'll see here, this number format, this is sort of what it will look like. And with the number format, you can actually change the number of decimal points within that specific data. There are several other formats. If you are looking to use, say, scientific number notation, using exponential notation, you can do that as well. Sometimes Excel will default to that if it perceives the data to sort of need to be in that format, or if the numbers are really large. The main thing to remember here is just to have all of that consistent across whatever data that you're working with. So that's going to come in really important when you're doing analysis later. If you have multiple worksheets that you're trying to do analysis on across data sets, you'll want all of those formattings to be consistent. So for today's purposes, we are going to stick with that general data format. All right, so now I'm going to go back into the slideshow for just a minute. So several pieces of this information will be available in the slides as well. So now we're going to actually go into formulas and functions. So just to give everyone a brief overview to sort of get us all on the same page, a formula is some expression or equation that performs calculations in your spreadsheet in a cell. A formula is always going to begin with an equal sign. That's very important for Excel to recognize it as a formula or a function. It needs that equal sign in front of it. Otherwise, it's just going to think that that's an inputted value that you're putting into the cell. So when you enter that equal sign into the cell, you're essentially telling Excel to calculate this, calculate something. Functions are Excel-defined formulas. So it kind of builds on that formula concept. They perform specific calculations. Some of the formulas, if you were to enter them kind of out by hand, some of those formulas would be really long and really onerous, depending on what type of analysis you're trying to do. So there are a lot of predefined functions in Excel that sort of allow you to perform certain types of analyses and calculations in a more streamlined way. So formulas can have a notation similar to what is shown here on the screen. This obviously isn't every single type of formula. We would be here for many hours if we did that. But this is sort of an example of what those formulas are going to look like. So you have your equal sign to tell Excel that you're doing some sort of calculation. And then you are going to tell Excel what cells or what values you want to perform that calculation on, and then specifically what you want them to do. So here I just show basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And I'll show what those mean here in a second. This sort of gives you what each of those actually stands for. All right, for functions, before we actually get in and do some demonstrations, the general format of a function is again with this equal sign, whatever function you are utilizing, and then whatever range you are doing that calculation over. So often when we are doing calculations, when we're doing analysis in Excel, we're not doing it just on 2 cells. We're often doing it on multiple cells or an entire range of cells or values. So within your function, within those parentheses, you're going to put whatever range you're doing those calculations on. I put here just a few examples of the different functions that are available in Excel. This is not every function. There are hundreds of functions, and they add more with each update to the software. You can find sort of a list of those and some resources both within the software, and then I'll have some links at the end of the presentation as well. And again, you can write these directly into the cells. You can utilize the sort of function toolbar as well to write these. So either option is going to work. So we'll get out of here and we will go back to our spreadsheets. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is demonstrate those formulas. So I'm just going to demonstrate addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, just as an example of how we can utilize Excel to enter those formulas. So I'm going to go over here to an empty cell. So this was selected completely at random, no rhyme or reason, just so we have an empty space to do those calculations. So what we are going to do is I'm going to, within the cell, I'm going to type that equal sign. So this tells Excel, hey, we're going to calculate something. I'm going to select this first value in cell C2. So within our Alabama portion of our data set, and then I'm going to do addition with the cell below it. So this cell C3. So to do that, I'll use the plus sign and then select cell C3 and then hit enter. And so this added the two values over here. You'll see if you look up in our formula bar, you'll see that formula is present there as well. So we can actually use that to actually do that calculation. So if we select the cell below, now we go up to our formula bar and let's type our equals here. You'll see this appears in our cell as well. Go to C2. We're going to use the minus sign, C3, and then hit enter. And if we highlight that again, we'll see that this is present in our formula bar. I'm going to add some notations here so that we know what exactly we are doing. So this is important to do if you are doing data analysis. Always notate what you are doing in your cells, what type of calculations that you are doing, so that if you need to go back for those later, you can find those. All right, so if we want to multiply, this time I'm going to equals, and I'm just going to type the cell name directly. So I'm going to type cell C2. To multiply, you use the little asterisk above the 8 on your keyboard, and then cell C3, and hit enter. And then for our last example, we're going to C2 slash C3, and this will do our division. So those are some quick examples of how you would write out simple formulas within Excel. You can do more than 2 values. I just did those for sort of ease of example and demonstration, but you can type out as many cells, values, operations as you want. But as I mentioned before, if you are doing kind of some more complex calculation on like one piece of data or several pieces of data, that can often get very complex, and those formulas can get very unwieldy. And if you have any experience with coding software or doing any type of coding, you'll know that one little error somewhere within that formula or somewhere within those values will throw off your entire calculation. So that's where the functions come in really nicely. So what we are going to do here is we're going to calculate some averages. And so we're first going to calculate averages for this entire data set. So all of these commute times, and then we're going to calculate averages on each specific state. So we'll look into how we pull out specific parts of our data set and do calculations on those. So what I'm going to do here is say total for total average, and then we'll say Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. All right. So if we want to do just an average on all of our data, we don't have any other criteria that we're going to use, we can use something called the average function. So fairly self-explanatory. So one nice thing about Excel is if you start typing in the name of a function that it recognizes, it will often pop up with several different options. So you'll see there's several different types of averages. and we'll utilize another one of these here in a second. But I can go ahead and double click on average. You can just type out the whole thing as well. So now you'll see equals average and then an open parentheses. Now this is where you're going to select what data that you want to include. And there's a few different ways you can do this, primarily either by highlighting which type of data you want to use, or by typing in that actual cell range. Here, I am just going to highlight this column. This is easier in this instance since this is a smaller data set. If this was a larger data set, actually kind of typing in that cell range might be easier. So if we have our range from C2 to C29, make sure to close your parentheses first or you will get an error message. And then if we hit enter, so now this will give us the average for our entire data set for this whole column. So if you highlight this, you'll see that formula appears both in this cell and up in your formula bar. All right, so that's for the whole data set or for all of our columns. But let's say you're wanting to calculate averages for kind of subparts of your data set, right? Different parts with certain criteria. In this instance, I want to calculate the averages for each specific state. So Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. Now we can, since this data is really nicely sorted, we could just calculate a regular average, using highlighting the specific data here. But imagine that we have a really large data set, with like hundreds and hundreds of rows, and your data is sorted several different ways. It's going to be really hard to go through and find all of those different values that you might want to average. So for this calculation, we're going to use something called the average if function. So what this is going to do is we're first going to search over a range for a specific set of values. And these can be either text values or numerical values. So this is where we're going to look for our specific states that we want to look at. So our first criteria. So here we want to look at Alabama. So to use this function, we're going to actually select this entire range. So this is our D2 to D29. So D2 colon D29. And so what this is going to do is it will look over this entire range for cells that match the criteria Alabama. And then what that will do is it will average over the corresponding values in the second range. So in this instance, that's going to be our C2 to C29. So if we look at this again, we're looking at our column D, so our text values for our different states. It's going to search over that range for cells that have the criteria Alabama. And then when it finds those cells and any data that corresponds to that within our spreadsheet, it's then going to average over the values in column C. So you'll see this is our value. This is just averaged here. So it's a little bit lower than our total average. We can do this for all of our different states as well. So I'll go through this one a little bit quicker since we went through the first part. So if I say equals, you'll see average if is one of the options. If you go here, if we highlight our column D, now we are looking at Florida. And we will want to make sure we put that text value in quotations so that Excel knows what we're looking for. And then C2, C29, close our parentheses, and hit enter. So now we've averaged over our Florida values. And now finally, our Georgia values. Oops, make sure that I'm not holding down the shift button. Say D2, D29, Georgia. We're looking in C2 to C29. All right, so that gives us our average for our Georgia values. So the average if function essentially lets you take an average over specific subsets, subparts of your data set. There are a few other sort of if functions as well that are sort of tacked on to other functions where you can do calculations on specific parts of your data set. These can be really, really useful if you want to do some comparisons or you want to do sort of analysis on specific parts of your data instead of the entire data set. All right. You see any questions in chat? We're all good? All right. I guess my meeting controls would probably pop up if we do. All right. So now we are going to talk about a specific add-in that is in Microsoft Excel that you can use to perform some different statistical analysis. So Excel over time has added different features to sort of enable kind of more in-depth data analysis. It's not always been, it really still isn't like Excel's primary function to sort of do hardcore data analysis like you might do in a Python or an R or some other dedicated specific statistical analysis program. But Excel does have some really good features where you can do some statistical tests. And one of the add-ins that allows you to do that is something that is called the Analysis Tool Pack. So this is an add-in in Excel that allows us to do data analysis and gives access to a variety of statistical functions and tests. It allows us to do these without manually entering the functions, which we were doing previously. So it sort of streamlines that a little bit. This is automatically included with Excel, but by default it is not enabled. So you do have to actually enable this, and I'll go into this in a second and how to actually do that. It can be a little bit hard to find if you don't know where you're looking. And one cautionary note is this does only work at this time in the most recent versions. It only works on one worksheet at a time. So if you're wanting to do some of these tests over several different spreadsheets, several different worksheets, you will have to do that for each worksheet. So I have sort of a screenshot here for how to load the Analysis Tool Pack. And we'll actually show that live here in a second. But to do that, you're actually going to go all the way over to the most left-hand tab on your Excel. So if I do that, if we go over to the File tab, so this is where you're, saving your files, opening your files, etc. We'll actually want to go all the way down to this Options button here. And if we click this, can we see that pop up in Zoom? Awesome. Okay. Sometimes with Zoom, you can't actually see pop-ups. So if we get this Excel Options box, we'll want to go down to Add-ins. And what you'll want to do then is go to Manage. And if you hit Manage, Excel Add-ins, this is usually selected by default. It's usually the first thing But if it's not, make sure that that is selected. And then we're going to hit OK. Okay, actually, that is not what we do. My apologies. So what we actually want to do is add-ins. We actually want to hit Go. OK is just like, oh, you're OK with everything. So we actually want to click on this add-ins, which will bring up another pop-up. And here you'll see several different add-ins. These are add-ins that are automatically included in Excel. We're not utilizing any other software on this computer that might add something into Excel. So you'll see when you go here, you have a few different options, and the analysis tool pack is the top one. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to check this. So put a check mark by analysis tool pack, hit OK. And then if you go to this data tab for here, and you go all the way over to sort of the right-hand side of the screen here at the top, you'll see this data analysis button. And this is where the data analysis tool pack is going to live once you enable it. Once you enable it on your computer, if you have a version of Excel on your computer, it should stay on there until you disable it. You can disable it if you need to, like you can most other add-ons in Excel. But once you've added it in the first time, it should stay in that same spot. All right, so as I mentioned previously, the analysis tool pack gives us access to a wide variety of statistical tests. To actually access those, we go to our data analysis button, click on it, and you should see this little data analysis box that comes up. And we'll see several different types of tests and analyses that we can choose from. So things from ANOVA to correlation, descriptive statistics and summary statistics, histograms, t-tests, c-tests, etc. So we have several different options that we can use. Due to kind of the time we have in our workshop, I won't have time to go over every single test, and some of these tests may not apply to our specific data set either. But I will share some resources on how to utilize some of these different tests. This will sort of demonstrate one way to utilize this tool pack. It is important to note before I get into this, there are a few limitations to doing data analysis with this tool pack. For one, you do need to arrange the data in Excel in a certain way for many of these tests. So that will often require, doing some data cleaning, some data sorting like we've done previously, potentially a lot of copying and pasting and moving things around, if you're going to be performing multiple different tests on your data. Certain tests can only be performed on one column or one range at a time. So if you're doing more complex tests or more complex analyses, this may be a little more time consuming. And also from sort of a data management, kind of keeping track of your data perspective, Excel doesn't really log what you are doing. So there's no like automatic log of, hey, you did this test, and then you did this test, and this test. So I highly recommend keeping track of that. If you are doing some analyses on, say, experimental data or data that you've collected for a project, highly recommend keeping track of that in a, like, say, Word document or some other word processing software, or even a notebook, so that you can go back later in case you need to reperform those analyses, or if you see something wrong, you can go back and try and fix that later. All right. But sort of despite all of those challenges and sort of like those limitations, this is a really good feature of Excel if you're looking to quickly perform some of these different statistical analyses and tests, and you may be don't have access to another statistical analysis program, or you haven't utilized one of those before, this is a really good place to perform some of those calculations. So what we are going to do here for our examples today is we're going to get some summary statistics for our data set, looking at our different commute times. And to do that, I'm going to use this commute summary tab. So this sort of summarize tab of our times, which are in minutes, and then sorted by year and by state. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our data analysis tool pack. I'm going to select descriptive statistics from the analysis tools options and then hit OK. You'll then see a pop-up window that will allow us to input the range that we are going to be performing our analyses on, and then sort of some different options for how we want to output this data. So we're going to do this again by state. So to get our input range, I'm going to first click this little arrow, which will let us sort of go over here and highlight what range that we're looking at. So we're looking at our B1 to B8, so our column B, and make sure this is grouped by columns. If you're doing analyses by rows, you would select rows. And then I'm going to check labels in the first row so that it knows not to try and perform any sort of analyses on that header. And then we'll select our output options. So this first set of options with these sort of circular bubbles is where you want to output your data. So you can either output it on the same worksheet. So if you want to have this somewhere else within your worksheet, you can sort of output this in a new worksheet. So Excel will make a new tab and a new worksheet, which is what I sort of recommend just for general data management, data sorting purposes. Or you can do this in a completely new workbook if you're going to use this to maybe do further analyses. I'm going to actually use a new worksheet, and I'm just going to name that with our state. And then I'm going to want some summary statistics. And the summary statistics that Excel outputs are already by default entered in, so it's not going to give us specific options for that. So we're going to select summary statistics, and then we're going to hit OK. And you'll see Excel has made a new tab. It has taken our data for Florida, and it has outputted several different values. So these are some different statistical values that you might perform over a specific data set. Within Excel, they're primarily looking at sort of the central tendency of the data. So they're looking at the mean or the average, the sort of median or midpoint of a specific set of numbers. And then mode, it is the most frequently occurring number. That is NA here because all of our numbers were different. So there is no mode. So that's why you'll see that here, and you'll actually see that for all three of our sets of data. And then you'll see some different measures of variability, how our different values vary within each other, looking at things like standard deviation, variance, and sort of the range of our data. And then the last couple of things where they talk about skewedness and kurtosis is sort of talking about the distribution of our values and sort of looking at how symmetrical those are and sort of some different characteristics if you were doing a distribution. So just some general definitions on what each of those means. If we go back to our commute summary tab, and let's say now we want to get summary statistics for Georgia, we're going to do the same procedure, go up to data analysis, select our summary descriptive statistics. We're going to go back into our range, and now we are going to select our C1 to C8, Georgia, and most of our other values, since we just did this, are already pre-selected. We will change the name of our next worksheet to Georgia, so we don't have the same name for two worksheets. And again, we'll want summary statistics. And then we will hit OK. And you see we get the same statistics here. And then finally, if we do this for Alabama, descriptive statistics, and in this instance, again, we are just changing our input range, or the range we want the statistics on, and then changing the name of our worksheet. So that is one example of how you can utilize the analysis tool pack. If you have some data, you want to get some quick summary statistics on that data, just sort of looking at sort of the tendency and the variability of your data set and the distribution of your values. The descriptive statistics is a really good thing to use in Excel. Obviously, there are many more different types of analyses that you can do. For the sake of time, we won't go into those. There will be some resources on those towards the end. Of course, you can always ask questions about those later on. All right. Back to here. All right, so sort of the last thing that we are going to talk about today is charts and graphs. So we've talked about how to get our data into Excel. We've talked about how to write our formulas and our functions. We've gone over the analysis tool pack and how you can utilize that to analyze your data. Now we're going to talk about plotting your data. This is something that Excel is very commonly used for. A lot of folks use Excel to generate really nice charts and graphics for their data. And there are many different options for doing so. So there are a few quick things you want to think about when you are deciding how you're going to plot your data, how you're going to create your charts. You want to think about your purpose, what you're trying to display. As we'll see, Excel has many different options for charts, some really good for specific data, some maybe not so good. So think about what you're trying to display, what message you're trying to put forth. Pick a graph that makes sense for your data. Think about your specific audience, whether this is for say a research group or an academic audience, or whether this is maybe for a business group or maybe a private audience outside of academia. So think about your specific audience when you're thinking about how to display your data. And then we'll use something called the chart ribbon to build the graph. So if we go back into our Excel, I'm going to go back to our commute summary because that's what we will use to do our graph. So if we go to our so if we go to our Insert tab, if you go here sort of to the middle, you'll see this section for charts. So this is where you are first going to go if you are looking to plot your data. Now, we don't have any data selected yet, so it's not going to have necessarily any recommendations for us. So let's go ahead and select our data. Now you can go ahead and utilize one of the different chart options if you already know what you want to use. But if you're unsure of what specific chart or plot that you want to use, I like to go to this recommended charts button, and you'll see when you click that, it'll bring up several different options. And the really nice thing is it actually displays this here on the right-hand side, and what that will actually look like. And so this is where sort of the what graph is appropriate for your data piece comes in. You'll see that if you're wanting to say plot these, with year versus time, something like a line plot or a scatter plot might be useful. Something like a stacked plot may not be particularly useful for this specific data. So this is where having some knowledge of what types of plots might be useful to get the point across that I'm trying to get with my data. So in this instance, I'm going to use a scatter plot for this particular set of data. So if I select scatter and then hit OK, you'll see that Excel has generated this pop-up box with our chart. Now, I recommend when this comes up, I recommend sort of moving this to a new space where you can actually work on this graph. It's a lot easier to do it there than working on it kind of within another worksheet. So if we have our chart selected, you'll see now there's a couple of new additions to our toolbar. They call them chart tools. You'll see chart design and format. So format is kind of our standard shape fill, shape outline, sort of text editing type of things. Within our chart design, this is where you could change the chart type if you didn't like it, or we can move the chart. So I'm going to select Move Charts, and you can either, and I like to just move this to a new sheet. So I'm just going to call this Workshop Example. And so we'll see now this is moved completely to a brand new worksheet, so it's a lot nicer for us to work with. So now once you have your graph, you can do several different things to manipulate that. You'll see sort of at the top of the screen, you'll see your different chart design and chart formatting options. You can also click this little plus icon here at the top right, and this will allow you to add in things like axes titles or axes in general, data labels, so you can label each specific data points if that's something you're interested in. If there's any sort of error within your data, or if you're looking to add a trend line, if you're trying to extrapolate your data, you can add all of that in using this little plus button. So I'm just going to add axis titles real quick so that we can add a title for our horizontal and our vertical axes, and then add a title for our chart. So if I click this, this is a text box, so you're just going to be doing text entry in here. So if I select that, click year. So here, this is time in minutes. And then I am going to use commute times for our chart title. Now you'll see if I click on the actual axis itself, it's going to give me other options to format this axis over on the right-hand side. So if I go, say, over to the far right, I go to axis options, you can actually change which parts of your plot are displayed. So you'll remember the data that we had was only from 2013 to 2019. Excel has added in a little bit of extra white space, starting us at 2012 and going to 2020. So we can actually change the minimum and maximum that is displayed. So we can do that right here. If we say 2013 and then 2019, and Excel will automatically that. You can hit enter or click out of that and it will automatically perform that function. You can also change the units and the separation between each of your different spots on your axes. Here we're just going to leave it at 1 because we're looking at different years. But if we wanted to change that as well on our vertical axes, if say we wanted to look at say 0.25, you'll see we can do that over in our format axis box and it will change those values on our axes. So that's in general how you would do a plot. There's a lot of different options for formatting this within Excel. Some of these are more for display purposes, the different colors of your lines, whether you have grid lines or not, the sort of size of the text, etc. But some of them apply more to the values of your axes and the values themselves. All right, and so I have a few slides in here that sort of give some examples of how you would use the chart ribbon with some nice little animations. If you want to review these later, if you're looking at the video later as well. All right, so that brings us to the end of the most of the content for this workshop. So we kind of just scratched the surface today, going through Excel. You can see just from what we did today, Excel is really powerful. There's a lot of things that it can do, and there's much, much more that it can do. So if you are looking for different resources, for doing different operations in Excel, Microsoft, who runs Excel, has a lot of different great resources, videos and tutorials. If you're looking for a list of all the different functions that are in Excel, that is available as well. There is a lot of them. If that's something you're interested in looking at, I have linked that here as well. There's a lot of community-based resources from sites such as Stack Overflow and LinkedIn Learning, which FSU has a subscription to. So there's a lot of really great how-to videos for doing specific operations within Excel. I have put a link in here for working with the Analysis Tool Pack if you are specifically interested in doing work with that as well. And then, of course, either myself or those of us here at FSU Libraries, if you have any questions after today's workshop, or if you want to sit down and sort of go over some part of this more in depth, or if you're working with your data and wondering if Excel can be useful, we are always happy to sit down and talk with you. So I'll end with my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions. Thank you so much for those that were attended on Zoom and in person, and have a great rest of your afternoon.